just like Kagan's presidential administration article that is, I think, 5,000 pages long.
Of course, like Nick and Julian are writing like 150-page articles, and they are too long.
Eight section breaks.
I mean, this is really 3 papers, but like, Aaron and I are tired.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Just a brief reminder, please do maintain all proper COVID protocols for university requirements. Speakers, as far as that, I'm sorry, you are allowed to take your mask off when you're speaking, so choose. I'd like to welcome everyone to the event, the Constitutional Future of Independent Agencies. My name is Bryant Barber, and I'm a 1L representative for the Federalist Society chapter at Maurer. We're excited to have you join us for this discussion on independent agencies. The Federalist Society is a group of conservatives and libertarians interested in the current state of the legal order. It is founded on the principles that the state exists to preserve freedom, that the separation of powers is central to our Constitution, and that it is the duty of the judiciary to say what the law is, not what it should be. The Society seeks to promote an awareness of these timeless principles and to further their application through its lively debates and discussions. It is my privilege to introduce our distinguished panelists this afternoon. Christopher J. Walker received his law degree from Stanford and a master's in public policy from Harvard Kennedy School of Government. At Stanford, he served as managing editor of the Stanford Law Review and editor-in-chief of the Stanford Law and Policy Review. Professor Walker brings the extensive practical experience of having worked in private practice, as well as all 3 branches of the federal government, including clerking for Justice Kennedy of the United States Supreme Court and Justice Alex Kozinski of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. He now serves as the John W. Grecker Professor of Law at the Ohio State University Moritz College of Law and director of the Moritz Washington, D.C. Summer Program. Professor Walker's research focuses primarily on administrative law, regulation, and law and policy at the agency level, and his publications appear in numerous law reviews. Nicholas Amenderes joined the Maurer School of Law faculty in 2020 and from the University of Virginia School of Law, where he was program director of the Carr Center for Law and Democracy. He has taught at the Seton Hall University School of Law and Tulane University Law School, and clerked for the Honorable Janice Graham Jack in the Southern District of Texas. His research focuses primarily on accountability and democracy across areas of law, such as class actions, separation of powers, collective responsibility, and campaign fundraising. Professor Amenderes received his law degree from the New York University School of Law, where he was a Dwight D. Opperman Scholar and organized the symposium Tort Law in the Shadow of Preemption. He also earned his PhD in politics from New York University, with specialties in political economy and political theory. He has presented at workshops both in the United States and abroad. In addition to law reviews, his work appears in philosophy and political science journals. Please help me welcome our distinguished guests.
Awesome. Well, this is going to be a lot of fun. Being here, I can't, Saturday night, can I even mention the game, or probably not? Too soon. Any event, it's great to be here. I drove down this morning, and it was so much fun to drive through Ohio and then through Indiana. And it's really great to be here with Nicholas. I have to say, you all are so lucky to have him on your faculty. He's a cutting edge scholar, just a really thoughtful intellectual. And so I'm excited to talk with him and with you all today about the future of independent agencies. And this is going to come from my experience last year. One of my co-authors, Aaron Nielsen, got a call from the Supreme Court. The Trump administration decided not to defend the constitutionality of the Federal Housing Finance Agency. And so they appointed my regular co-author, Aaron, to defend the constitutionality of that independent agency. And he called me up and said, let's do this. And I was like, okay. So I put everything aside, and we spent a few months, writing the brief and preparing Aaron for argument in that case. And from that experience, I learned kind of 2 main things. The first is we lost 7-2, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. The Supreme Court struck down the good cause removal restriction for the head of the Federal Housing Finance Administration. In other words, the president could remove the head of that agency at will. And in fact, the next day, President Biden did, fired the head of that agency. In other words, there's been a long-standing separation of powers dispute about Congress and the president and whether Congress can condition removal of executive branch officials. It seems like that debate's over now after that case, if it wasn't over the term before in Saylor law. Indeed, it looks like the Supreme Court has adopted a unitary executive theory when it comes to the president's power of removal, such that I think the only thing that's standing between Humphrey's executor, the Supreme Court's famous 1935 decision, it said that Congress could condition the removal of multi-member independent commission members, independent agencies. I think the only thing that's standing between the Supreme Court and overruling that is stare decisis. In fact, you already have a number of scholars declaring the end of independent agencies after this case from last term. That's Collins v. Yellen. The second thing, and this is the central part of my talk and the paper, which I hope, if it wasn't already sent out, Michael could send it out, that Aaron and I put together, is that Congress has other tools to influence the president's behavior when it comes to removal. Even if removal restrictions are no longer good in our constitutional system, Congress has tools that have been around since the founding. They've been largely ignored in the scholarship and in debates about independent agencies, I think because we fixated so much on Humphrey's executor and the role of judicial review of removal restrictions. But these are really powerful tools, and we call them Congress's anti-removal power, and I'll kind of detail them in a second. But what this does, it allows Congress, even though the president can still formally remove anyone at will, these tools allow Congress to heighten the costs of removal for the president. For instance, the appointments clause. If the president wants to fire someone, they have to get someone confirmed in the Senate. And that's one part of this tool, is that Congress can say, we're not going to confirm as easily as you think. You might not get someone better than that's currently in that position. And so I'm going to kind of walk through these tools in a second, but our argument is that this isn't, I don't argue that it's as good as statutory removal restrictions. That's not where we're at. I mean, the writing's on the wall, they're gone. But I do think this is a really powerful toolkit that Congress has to continue to provide some level of independence at agencies. So today I'm going to kind of introduce that toolkit, or sorry, the Congress's anti-removal power and the toolkit that we've assembled that accompanies that to strengthen that removal power. And then I'm going to kind of take a deeper dive into one context where Congress could do something today, and that's in the context of agency adjudication. But before I do that, I wanted to provide a brief primer on independent agency. I'm guessing do we have 1Ls in the room? Yep, okay, good. So provide a little bit of a sense of federal agencies. So federal agencies, you can largely put them in two buckets: executive branch agencies like the Department of Justice, and independent agencies like the Federal Trade Commission. The primary difference is that the president can remove at will the head of an executive branch agency, whether it's State Department, Justice Department, things like that. But when it comes to independent agencies, Congress has, by statute, limited the president's ability to remove those officers. Has said they can only be removed for good cause or for negligence or neglect of office or things like that. And the reason that Congress has done this is they want those agencies to not be afraid of being fired, to act more independently, to have more decisional independence. And in fact, Congress has created all sorts of independent agencies, including officers at executive branch agencies who have independence, who the president can't fire at will. And if you're thinking about like why, think about some of the agencies we have that are independent. For instance, the Federal Election Commission. Congress would want the Federal Election Commission to be independent because they don't want the president tinkering in elections. At least that was our thought before the Trump administration, right? You have all the financial regulators, not all, but almost all, like the SEC, the CFTC. Again, Congress wants those to be independent so that when we're regulating markets aren't as swayed by presidential politics as maybe others. Other examples are the National Labor Relations Board, the Social Security Administration. Again, the hallmark for all of these is that we want some level of independence from presidential control in the presidential election cycle to allow kind of more expert-driven approaches to those types of regulatory actions. And as I mentioned at the outset, since 1935, the Supreme Court in Humphrey's executor has blessed this arrangement. Humphrey's executor upheld good cause removal restrictions at the Federal Trade Commission, another one that you could imagine wanting to be a little bit more independent from the president. And that's gone up until the Roberts Court. But in the Roberts Court, you've seen a majority of the court embrace more Justice Scalia's unitary executive theory when it comes to removal, to allow for the president to fire just about anyone in the executive branch. At least that seems to where we're going. Last year in a 5-4 decision, for instance, it's the Say law decision, if you've kind of heard this. the Supreme Court struck down removal restrictions for the single director head of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And then this year, in the case that Aaron and I served as court-appointed amicus, the Supreme Court took that a step further. In Saylor Law, the CFPB, the court said, this is an agency that exercises a tremendous amount of power over ordinary Americans, and so because it exercises so much executive power, you can't have a single director that's removable for cause. You've got to have at will removal. With FHFA, we argued unsuccessfully that it was different, that it just regulated Fannie and Freddie, it regulated the mortgage industry, it didn't regulate ordinary Americans, it didn't implicate the liberty interests that the majority had recognized in Saylor Law. Justice Kagan concurred in the result. She didn't join the opinion. I think that's important. And the reason she didn't join the opinion is that Justice Alito, writing for the court, provided no limiting principle in the opinion. There's really no way after Collins, the case that Aaron and I, participated in, to kind of see a limiting principle. In fact, in a footnote, we had a parade of horribles in our brief. And in a footnote, he wouldn't even say whether the head of the Social Security Administration, the head of the Federal Reserve, or even like high-ranking members of civil service, which all enjoy some removal protections, whether they're even constitutional. Taking its cue from the Supreme Court, the Biden administration's Office of Legal Counsel of the Justice Department issued an opinion 2 weeks later that said that President Biden could fire the head of the Social Security Administration, who had a 10-year term and couldn't be removed except for cause. And the next day, President Biden fired the head of the Social Security Administration. So we're in a world now where I think it is safe to say that the unitary executive theory is embraced not just by the court, but also by the White House in a pretty robust way. And many scholars are already saying that Humphrey's executor is next. Now, again, I think the conventional approach is that Humphrey's executor is the only thing that keeps agencies independent. And I'll kind of give you my pitch why that's not the case, that there are other tools that Congress has. And while we were researching for our amicus brief, we studied over 200 years of removal history before the court and within federal agencies. And we realized that the debate over Humphrey's executor was really overlooking Congress's anti-removal power. In other words, whether Congress has the ability to limit removal, we know whether or not that's true or not under the court's current approach, whether we overrule Humphrey's executor. It's definitely true that Congress has an anti-removal power, the ability to make it more costly for the president to remove, which would encourage the president not to remove officers unless they're really, really far outside their policy, the policy preferences of the president. And so the real world kind of effect of this is that by design, the Constitution envisions the presidents are going to give agencies a fair amount of decisional independence, even if they can't even though they can't fire the individuals at will. And the central place you see this power is in the Appointments Clause itself, right? So there, the Constitution gives the president the power to nominate the heads of agencies, principal officers, but the Senate has the opportunity, has the right of advice and consent to confirm. And you've seen this play out sometimes good and sometimes poorly over the last 20 years. But what this power does is, as Hamilton mentioned at the founding, is there's a silent operation to it. It brings stability of administration because the president's going to be worried about, if I fire the current head of that agency, can I get someone better confirmed? That's kind of the key of the anti-removal power, is the president's calculating, I got this person here and they're okay, they're not great. I want someone better. Can I even get that better person confirmed, right? Better in the sense of more aligned with my policy preferences. But the anti-removal power is not just about the Appointments Clause. There are other tools that Congress could use. And in our paper at the end of part 3, we kind of divide up these tools into kind of 3 buckets: soft powers, hard powers, and anti-evasion powers. I'll just kind of walk through a few of those now. So on the soft power front, turns out for decades that Congress has actually required, in cases where the president can remove at will, Congress has still required the president to provide reasons to Congress for why they're firing. The comptroller of currency is a really good example of that. Comptroller of currency has never been fired. Now, I don't want to overstate that. There are lots of other reasons why the comptroller of currency has never been fired. But we think part of the story is the president has to give public reasons for the firing. And it kind of raises the costs of that firing. The same is true of inspector generals. Until the Obama administration, the Trump administration, you had very few inspector generals fired. In the Obama administration, the Trump administration, you had more. But the public reason actually really elevated to the point that both administrations withdrew some of their firings in light of kind of the public response. Other soft tools that you can use is that Congress can enact statutory legislative findings. They can say in the statute that the agency is independent. They can set a number of terms. They can say in legislative findings why it should be independent, why it's so important. That way, if the president announces or is thinking about firing someone, the president's going to know that members of Congress are going to stand up and say, we all agree that this agency should be independent for X, Y, and Z. Why are you doing this? Give us reasons, right? Again, it just ups the cost. And the last one that I like a lot is if there's a firing, or if there's a firing without a good reason given as required by the statute, depending on how you want to modulate it, you could have a congressional hearing that's triggered under the statute, where the fired individual gets their day in the court of public opinion before a congressional committee, and other people can come testify as well to kind of explain why that person was fired and why that was bad or not. Again, raising the cost on the president when the president's deciding whether she wants to fire someone in the first place. So those are the soft tools. The hard tools are a little bit more aggressive. I admit that. The first one is probably least popular these days, but I'll throw it out there because I think it's a really powerful tool, which is the filibuster. Congress could, the Senate and its Senate rules could say that if you fire the head of the Fed, the closer vote requirement will be 70 instead of 50. Or if you hire the head of an independent multi-member commission, it's going to be 60 or something like that, right? The Senate can put that in the rules, which is pretty sticky, although not as sticky as it used to be. You know, they can go nuclear, as we have, as Congress has, both under Majority Leader Reid and then under Majority Leader Schumer. But we still think it has some stickiness there, especially for something like the head of the Federal Reserve. Another tool is that Congress could purposely slow down by rule or statute the process. They could require more debate. They could require more ripening time for a motion. Again, signaling that, hey, President, if you're going to fire this person, just know it's going to take a lot longer to get a replacement. And the last one is not one that I'm recommending. It sure sounds out of date today, but it was Madison's favorite at the founding, which is impeachment, or at least the threat of impeachment, right? Maybe you say in a statute that for the head of the Fed, if you don't provide a good reason, you know, this is on the table at least. Now, that used to mean a lot. I recognize in the Trump administration, it didn't seem to mean as much, the threat of impeachment. But we'll kind of get back to that perhaps in the Q&A. And then the last set of tools are the anti-evasion tools. And these are important. One of them is pretty obvious. Under the Constitution, the president has a recess appointments power. The Supreme Court has given Congress a ton of power to reject that. So the Senate has complete control. Like if it's a 3-day recess, it's not a recess. It's not, the Supreme Court has said. But the Senate can just stay in session along the rules the Supreme Court has given to ensure that the president can't replace the former Senate confirmed official with someone that's recess appointed. The next one, and this needs to be a whole separate paper. In fact, it is. A number of different scholars have spent a lot of time on this. Is acting officials. President Trump mentioned a number of times he loves acting officials. In fact, I think he liked them better in Senate confirmed. He seemed to have more control over them. When a Senate confirmed official is fired by statute, both the Federal Vacancies Reform Act and just by the agency's organic statute, there's a line of succession. And the president has the ability to kind of designate someone else for that position to play an acting role. There are many ways to limit who can do that, how long that can happen. A number of scholars have argued very forcefully. Nina Mendelsohn, for instance, argued the Constitution requires it to be more limited than it is. Whether the Constitution requires it, Congress can definitely reform the Vacancy Act to make it harder for a president to have a substitute in acting instead. And the last anti-evasion tool, which I think is really fun, is that Congress can limit sub-delegating with the agency so that if the agency head's going to be fired, can't sub-delegate it to other individuals, or if they want to get even more aggressive, they could actually say that when there's an acting head of an agency, the agency doesn't have the same powers. Maybe you don't give them the powers to enforce immigration laws, or maybe you don't give them the powers to do permitting at the EPA or something like that, right? So they can actually build into the statute more incentives for the president to come back to Congress with a new nominee that's going to go up for Senate confirmation. Again, the goal here isn't to get someone new confirmed, although that may be. The goal here is to raise the costs of removal for agencies that we think should be independent by kind of reinforcing this. Now, I want to note, like, none of these tools will guarantee agency independence. Like, that's not our argument. Like, no president is going to hesitate to fire the Secretary of State if they disagree on policy. That's just the reality of it. It's not an on-off switch. Instead, what our argument is to help Congress understand how they can increase the president's cost of removal for positions that they care about independence, like the head of the Federal Reserve, financial regulators, inspector generals, and the like. Okay, so I'm going to end now with a lot of you are probably thinking like, come on, Congress is broken. You know, like this is like a ridiculous, you know, it's so great of you to like come in here from the ivory tower and give us a bunch of tools. And like, if the president controls both, you know, the Senate, then it's going to work however the president wants. And if there's divided government, then it's never going to work at all, you know. And I have a few responses to that. One, and I can go this more in the Q&A. I actually think a lot of these tools, especially the soft powers and the anti-evasion powers, work really well in divided government. So I actually think that there is room there. Now, the second thing is, we're talking about constitutional law here, not statutory law or policy. And so even if today's Congress isn't willing to act, future Congresses could act, right, in the right political climate. And this is one great thing about tenures. I can plant seeds all day. You know, I think these are pretty good seeds. But the third one, I think the most important one is there's one context where the anti-removal kit could be used tomorrow, and that's an agency adjudication. I just want to kind of say, like, over the last few years, much, if not most of my research is focused on agency adjudication, and including a lot of interviewing and surveying of agency adjudicators and appellate staff and management of these agencies. And I'll kind of give you my really quick pitch on why you should care about agency adjudication. There are over 12,000, there are 800 Article 3 judges in the United States. There are over 12,000 federal agency adjudicators and agencies that adjudicate millions of claims a year, ranging from Social Security and veterans benefits to immigration removals and relief, as well as to patent rights. It's a tremendously important part of our federal administrative judiciary. And when Congress enacted the Administrative Procedure Act, they envisioned that these individuals, these adjudicators, would be independent. They provided for a merit-based hiring system that was politically insulated. And they also provided for the agency, for them to be not fired easily. They have for-cause protection, and not just for-cause protection from the agency head, who's a political appointee, but if the agency head wanted to fire them, they had to go through the Merit Protection Services Board in order, it's a more merit approach to fire them. And the whole idea here is that they wanted, the Congress wanted these agency adjudicators to feel that they were independent so they could faithfully apply the law to the facts and not be ruling based on politics or political pressure or the fear of being fired. Justice Breyer has repeatedly warned that the separation of powers cases we've been talking about can easily be applied to agency adjudicators to completely destroy their decisional independence. And in fact, we already see that happen. In recent years, the Supreme Court has said that these adjudicators are not employees, but they're officers of the United States under the Appointments Clause, which means that the head of the agency gets to appoint them. So you have some politics at the front end now. They've also said that the agency head has final decision-making authority just last term over these decisions, that Congress cannot legislate around that. Again, so that the head of the agency is going to make a political decision or policy decision, and these agency adjudicators know that they're being watched, right? And the last one I think that's coming to the court in the near future is, and it went before the DC Circuit last year, and the DC Circuit dodged it on procedural grounds, is eventually the Supreme Court is going to say that the agency head has to be able to remove these individuals for cause. That's where we're going, and that'll really change the dynamics of adjudicator decisional independence with these more than 12,000 adjudicators we have in the federal system. Now, the AntiRemoval Toolkit can help here. One, for adjudicators that Congress thinks should really be independent, they could actually make them principal officers. I'm not saying all 12,000, but you could imagine the appellate body within the agency, the 3-member or 5-member appellate body, all of those being Senate confirmed officials that have removal protections, or at least have, Senate confirmed officials that have these anti-removal, kind of tools around them. That would allow for a lot more decisional independence, at least at the appellate level. And in fact, Congress is going to do a bill here really soon to do that with the Patent Trial and Appeal Board. And I can talk about that more in the Q&A. But even if they're inferior officers, if Congress decides not to make them principal officers or otherwise decides not to have them Senate confirmed, these soft tools could be really powerful here. Requiring reason giving, requiring the agency head to say why they fired an adjudicator raises the stakes considerably. Requiring a hearing where the adjudicator and quite frankly, the adjudicator's union and the agency head all have to come testify raises the stakes considerably. It's going to make an agency head think twice about firing. The last few years, I did a couple of years ago, I did a study on on the role of agencies in drafting statutes. And one of the kind of the, not remarkable to anyone that studies Congress and agencies, but remarkable, I think, to others is that agencies are really, really, really receptive to congressional oversight on that front. Like if their agency head has to go testify before a hearing, they do everything Congress wants before. And their biggest fear is that the agency head's going to be caught up in some scandal before Congress and that the agency gets detoured from its regulatory agenda. So I think this is an area where there could be a lot of movement today. There's bipartisan support, if not consensus, for the idea that adjudicators should be independent, just like our Article 3 judges should be impartial and independent, right? And so this is something I think Congress could do tomorrow, quite frankly. And in fact, I would be surprised if they start introducing some of these tools in that context. So I'll just kind of just end. Maybe stare decisis is the only thing that separates the Supreme Court from Humphrey's executor. And that type of removal restriction for agency independence might be gone. But Aaron and I argued that that's not the only way to create independence. And it's time to kind of focus a lot more of our scholarly energy and some policy conversations on Congress's anti-removal power and the toolkit that strengthens it. And I think today, like now, is the time for us to explore this in the agency adjudication context. So I'll just stop there. Nicholas can tell me why I'm completely wrong.
Oh, no. No, it's great. It's great to see you. Thanks for the kind words. There's a lot in this paper that I like and a lot to like. So I will have some critical comments, as you can expect, that I hope are thought-provoking and also help Chris and Aaron as they continue to work through these ideas. But I think it's a very nice paper and does what a lot of really good legal scholarship should do, which is to be both creative and formative and push us out of, especially in this area, what has been a narrow frame, kind of an obsession with removal protections. I mean, I think you really set yourself up with a challenge because you've got like 1 foot in doctrine, 1 foot in political realities. I guess it's good you're co-authors because I have a 3rd foot, which is historical practice as well, right? It's a lot of kind of balls to keep in the air. Like one small thing I like is I like that label anti-removal power because I think we've been obsessed with agency independence too long. And as those of you who are my students know, I do love me a good spatial model. And I love the invitation to look down the game tree, which is the heart of game theory, which is to recognize these dynamics unfold and people are anticipating what's going to happen in the future. And to see how law, broadly construed, constitutional provisions, norms, historical practice, all inform that. So got a few comments on the paper in kind of increasing levels of wonkishness. So the first thing I want to flag is that Congress is dysfunctional by design. Maybe not as dysfunctional by design as it presently is, but there is dysfunction built into it. One of the strengths of agency independence that the anti-removal power preserves is that it gives Congress a tool for a policy fight with the president that does not require full-bore legislation. And it's important because the president has a powerful role in legislation. So already, anytime Congress wants to fight the president on a legislative level, they've got to overcome the veto. That's going to be a real challenge, right? Agency independence and anti-removal have a kind of set it and forget it quality, or at least more of a set and forget it quality. So that makes it really attractive to Congress. Okay. Now, the basic heart of it, increasing the costs of removal, I think is both a creative idea and I am completely on board with. I think it's undoubtedly true. I think some of the mechanisms might do better jobs and worse jobs of increasing the costs. But I think the heart of the project, okay, especially when we sort of set aside some of the loopholes with like acting, that sort of thing, has a lot of strength to it. But I want to make what I think is an important distinction between increasing the direct costs of removal and the indirect costs of removal. So I want us to consider 2 anti-removal acts. Okay, Anti-Removal Act number 1. If an agency head is fired without good cause, the budget allocations for the military, Social Security Administration, and Department of Veteran Affairs will be set to $0 for the next 2 years. Anti-Removal Act number 2, it should be a crime to fire an agency head without good cause, resulting in 1 or more years of imprisonment. Now, there are problems with both those acts, right? But you get the idea, right? Those would directly increase the cost of fire, right? And would thus have the effect of increasing what in the paper describes the president's indifference zone, the range of policies he would tolerate from a recalcitrant agency. Now, that, as far as I understand, is not how the anti-removal power you're discussing really works. It's through indirectly increasing the costs by heightening the difficulty in getting a replacement. Okay. Now, with that kind of observation in mind, two kind of thoughts. One is the potential judicial response, right? You mentioned the unitary executive theory, which I think is undergirding all of this. To the extent anything is effective, any of the anti-removal power is effective at preserving some sort of independence, some sort of policy independence, right? For an agency, I wonder if there's a principled reason why a court, right, given the justifications they put on the table, given this unitary executive doctrine and the really strong muscular versions put out, especially in cases like Collins, they wouldn't just treat it the same way. In other words, they wouldn't just read the paper like, oh, this is agency independence masquerading under a different name, right? Now you might say, well, there's a difference of degree rather than kind, right? So the question would be, well, how much agency independence, right? How much agency policy freedom, I guess, would the court tolerate? And I suspect the answer might be very close to zero, right? So that's one thing. The other thing is to think, is that crazy? Because if the anti-removal power is used really robustly, in other words, if the costs get really high, is that not operationally equivalent to just agency independence? And that's maybe a good story for you guys. Oh, this works. Or a bad story if the court sees that and says, and we're going to strike it down for just that reason. And then finally to the wonkish bit, right? So I pulled two quotes from Romeo and Juliet, which is something I never do. One is all are punished, or punished, I guess technically, for iambic pentameter reasons, or a plague on both your houses, which I would add to a cost on all your houses. So I am completely on board with the relative simplicity of the models in the paper. And I mean that completely completely sincerely. It is always a challenge in modeling to try and keep things simple, and it's always a virtue because any additional degree of complexity you add obscures things, right? And so it's a judgment call. It's art, judgment, not science and math to figure that out, okay? But I think you may be missing something that's both subtle and substantial here. And to illustrate that, I'm going to deploy another game theory concept called a war of attrition. Okay. So leaving an agency post unfilled, especially when we do all the stuff, right, that say Anne Joseph O'Connell will suggest to deal with actings and vacancies and all those problems, is costly to the president. Right? It's got to be. Otherwise, anti-removal power doesn't have that many teeth, right? And there are reasons to believe it's costly, right? A headless agency is less effective. In fact, I would break this cost down into two categories, which hopefully there's a reason. Hopefully this distinction will make sense in a second, okay? One is just a headless agency is weaker, right? It's less effective, can't get as much stuff done. And two, it's harder to steer the agency to change its policies because that's really what the agency leadership's job is, okay? Critically though, vacancies can impose those same costs on Congress itself, okay? Those effects on the agency, those two weaknesses, hit Congress too. So embedded in these spatial models, I think, is a war of attrition between the president and Congress. Okay? And so the question is basically who's going to yield first? That's the idea of a war of attrition, right? And the results that are going to depend on how those costs of having a headless agency are distributed. So hard to make a general statement. But again, I'm going to ask us to consider two scenarios. Okay, so scenario one is the president very much wants to change the course of the agency, while Congress is quite comfortable with the status quo. That is, I think, a version of one of your anti-removal stories, right? That puts the anti-removal power very firmly in the hands of Congress, right? And the president is only going to fire the head of the agency when they have a real serious policy disagreement. Or even going further, and this is something I don't think you touched on too much in your talk, the anti-removal power can be calibrated. So Congress can kind of decide how much policy, I hate to use the word independence, but how much policy independence, how much policy freedom this particular agency is going to have, right? So that's like the anti-removal power doing its job. Flip it though, and imagine the agency delivers vitally important services to key members of Congress constituents. And that's not a crazy belief, right? Then that war of attrition probably favors the president, right? Who can say, you know what? I can live without a Social Security Administration working that well. How about you? You got midterms coming up, right? Something like that. And that makes it look ineffective. And that might put some serious limits on the impact of the anti-removal power. And it might point to a deregulatory bias, which to Chris and Aaron's credit, like they take on head on in the paper, right? Recognizing that there is a potential, they want to address that potential deregulatory bias. But all else being equal, a deregulatory president prefers a fully staffed agency because that allows them to steer it and make them do what they want. But they don't have to be comfortable with a federal government that just doesn't work. They just have to be a little bit more comfortable with it than Congress in the war of attrition story. So actually, like my final comments, which is an observation really inspired by the paper, which is that Congress's power through personnel seems to be fundamentally negative. Right? I think reading your paper, it dawned on me that if you look at anti-removal power to agency dependence to even appointments, Congress really has the capacity to say no, especially no to the president's policy initiatives, but it's got a really hard time pushing its own policy initiatives through personnel. And that leaves the avenue of legislation, but then it's got to confront the president and their veto power. And that actually plays a whole other game theory concept that I think is actually floating thread here, which is the agenda center model. But I've mentioned two models in a response to a talk, so I feel like that's hit my limit. So thanks.
So I'm smiling really big. I want to have a couple of responses and open up to Q&A, but because on the court judicial review front, when Aaron and I first kind of thought of this paper right after actually before Collins came down, like earlier, like we've been thinking about it for, we took it to the Originalism unitary executive folks, and we were like, give us one reason why this is unconstitutional, and they had none.
So it takes someone like me to be like, wait a second, should this be
unconstitutional? So they said, well, if you try to put the filibuster reform in a statute, that's probably unconstitutional.
Yeah,
I think it is unconstitutional. Congress does lots of stuff unconstitutional anyways because it raises the costs. We have the one house veto of those who are taking administrative law. They're still putting statutes even though they're unconstitutional because they raise the costs. On the Senate to party. So there's that. But and some people try to say a reasonably given requirement is unconstitutional. I don't buy it. I don't see this court if it's committed to kind of a constitutional project, and maybe I'm too optimistic that it is. That it does this. Now, I will say it drives them crazy, these unitary executive theorists, because they realize that Congress still has a ton of power. Although someone like Cypher Caution, his response was like, "This is all politics. I don't care. Like as long as the court can't enforce it, it doesn't really matter, right?" The one other thing I'd say is I actually think this paper has a lot to teach unitary executive theorists. I think it has, we don't try to do it in the paper, but I think we're trying to have a conversation with conservatives, because my view of the removal restrictions is that the remedy matters. I don't think the remedy is reinstatement. I think it's damages. In other words, if the president fires someone and doesn't have a good reason, and they go to court and sue, the Supreme Court's never resolved this. But I don't think that the person gets their job back. I don't think the court has the ability to say, you are now the head of the Federal Reserve again. No, I think the only remedy they have is they get paid for wrongful termination. They get back pay. And if that's the case, I actually don't even think that's unconstitutional under unitary executive theory. Like if that's so I think there's a lot going on there. But this also gets to the other side. You're like, well, what happens if it gets so extreme that like Congress will just start imposing this at will? And I hope it, and maybe it doesn't come through the paper enough. The costs are on both sides here, right? If Congress plays too aggressive, they also have to pay costs. If they try to, they've got to calibrate their game as well. And if they can't make the pitch to the public that this should be independent or that we should be paying, the cost, these tools aren't going to have the power they would. So I actually think the game has costs on both sides, and both sides are kind of invested in what level of independence do we want to have or not. At least that's kind of my pitch on that. I'm going to skip the spatial models, or I want to talk with you offline about that because I think you're right. I also think I don't want to get the models more complicated because it's just. But I do think that Congress pays the price too, and that's part of the calculus that kind of has to play out there. But I do want to end on the personnel part. So Brian Feinstein and Jennifer Ngo have a new paper out on independent agencies. And again, we're talking about independent agencies here, not agencies writ large. And it turns out that where do a lot of the heads of independent agencies come from, multi-member commissions? Congress. They're congressional staffers. Look at the FTC right now. I think almost all of them have been tied to Congress and the like. So I actually am not sure that's the case with independent agencies, that it's a negative power. I think that if there are openings, Congress has a lot of sway when it comes to independent agencies, especially ones that have multi-member or bipartisan balancing, of putting their people in charge of those agencies, which is a weird dynamic. It messes up my model with removal, like, because maybe Congress wants the president to remove those really easily because they want to put new people in that they like. Or I don't know. I mean, although these tools would actually provide them a lot of power to put people in that they want, as opposed to people that the president would prefer over those people, right? And then the last thing that I just kind of say, and then we can, you can respond, we can open up to questions too, is that I don't want to suggest, and Nicholas hammered on this, you don't use this toolkit full force on every single type, right? Like an inspector general, you're not going to have a filibuster. You want an inspector general to be replaced, you know, like, so you don't want to, you want to increase the cost of removal, but you don't want to, the president say, oh, sorry, I fired these people. Now I've got to get 70 votes to replace them. When it comes to an inspector general, that's not a tool you'd use. So you really do have to modulate these tools depending on, what works the best. And one of them, which gets to the deregulatory point, which by the way, I'm glad that you were graceful about it and recognizing that a successful deregulatory president needs personnel at agencies. Like, I mean, the idea that agencies that don't have personnel somehow are good for deregulatory presidents is, I think Trump proved that wrong. But you do have with those the ability to lost my train of thought. I'll just stop there. I forgot what I was going to say. It would have been amazing too, I'm sure. All right, let's see, what questions do you have? Or do you have any other responses? Or?
No.
Thoughts? Yeah.
With the current makeup of the Supreme Court, who are the justices to watch in avenue elections? So you just described the one here, but as this continues to go forward, hopefully, probably, like, who are you targeting as justices that really care and shape this issue?
Yeah, I mean, so I actually think the anti-removal power, there are hints of it all over Kagan's opinions, and I know that's not the fifth vote you need for this stuff, but she's a pretty influential vote. So I think she's kind of she's reminded the court in a number of opinions that the removal power is not the only power for agency independence, right? But when you're thinking about in the six kind of justice majority, this is actually Kavanaugh land, quite frankly. I mean, he's very strong in Humphrey's executor. I don't know how he could push back on this stuff. I don't see him coming. He likes to have a coherent theory, and I'm not sure where that goes, right? And then kind of similarly, you just never know where the chief's going to be on stuff like this, right? I mean, he's an institutionalist, and I think it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Unfortunately, I think Breyer's probably one of the ones most expert on Congress, and at least I don't expect him to be on the court much longer. But beyond him, you actually don't have a lot of legislative expertise, which is interesting for a court of 9. And I don't know, like, Thomas is just going to stay straight, originalism. I don't think this affects his calculus at all. He doesn't even care, right? I don't know Alito. I've never gotten a good sense of where Alito's at on this stuff.
I mean, he might be the one who might read what I read, which was it's a weird view, because it's a view that starts from a kind of, you were mentioning, like kind of like an originalist unitary executive view, and then graphs on functionalism on top of it. Like, oh, this is, here's a phrase you don't hear from originalist opinions drafted: operationally equivalent, right?
Yeah.
So, but he might be a place where you could see that in parts. I think he's not, but this is me just speculating.
The last one I mentioned is Justice Gorsuch. Read his dissent in Oil States, which was a constitutional challenge to the Patent Trial Appeal Board, patent adjudication of the agency. He has a whole riff about how awful it is for the Constitution for agency adjudicators to base decisions based on politics. And so I actually think on the agency adjudication front, he would be like probably the biggest cheerleader for this.
And he's drawing a big line between policymaking and adjudication.
Yeah,
right?
And so I think like this is the type of thing that like, oh yeah, this makes sense. Now, of course, I mean, Nicholas thinks, I don't think this stuff is ever going to make it to court. I don't know how anyone could. I just don't think it's I don't see the constitutional challenge. Maybe that's a blind spot, and you can put on your unitary executive hat and tell me why.
Oh yeah, because I
mean,
get a great one.
For me, this is just like pure politics. Unless the court's willing to say that the filibuster is unconstitutional, which it's never going to be willing to say that. Like, there's no way. How do you even get that to court? I just don't see that. These types of tools just don't get to court too often. I guess the one area where it could is with actings, like the Antivision Tools could, right? If Congress tried to overly restrict actings, but if you read the Supreme Court's recent decision on actings, they want to restrict actings. They think the Constitution either requires it or that gives Congress the power to do it. And then on subdelegations is another, if you're going to try to kind of constrain what an acting can do or what can be subdelegated to lower level officials, that could also get to court. But again, conservatives don't like delegation and they don't like actings using power that, without Senate. So I actually think those tools, the conservative Supreme Court's pretty excited to kind of bless whatever Congress wants to do there.
That sounds about right to me.
Yeah. Other question. Oh, that's it.
I think we're on mic.
Let's talk about generally at the end in terms of the anti-regulatory bias, but how do some of these tools, including the soft tools and the indirect tools, work for a president like President Trump, for example, who I think the CFPB or generally agencies that use intent being headless, how they work in reference to those types of situations?
Yeah, I mean, Trump's the bad. It's just bad for me on the soft tools and the hard tools. I think it's a tough argument to make. I mean, a soft tool would work with pretty much any president. I mean, Trump seemed to embrace the idea of fighting with Congress over Twitter and in the public sphere. And maybe that's the future of the Republican Party. I don't know. If it is, then I think that the hard tools are going to be hard to use and the soft tools won't have as much power. But the anti-evasion tools definitely will have a lot of power. I mean, especially if you can rein in the use of acting. I mean, again, if your goal is to try to prevent the president from firing someone unless they really, really disagree, like, wide in the indifference range, then knowing that they can't replace them with just some crony that they lined up in the agency, not through Senate confirmation, that's a really powerful tool. And then on the subdelegation, kind of the deregulatory front, Jonathan Adler and I have a pretty crazy paper where we argue that Congress should have to reauthorize agencies, or at least they should consider like a sunset type approach. But what we do in that one is we talk about the sunset default. And I think that's important, that Congress could set the default of if you fire someone and you put an acting in place, the agency is restricted in ways that no one wants, right? That both sides don't want, right? So in the immigration context, it might be, hey, no immigration enforcement at the border or something, right? Something crazy. And no benefit grants. Or if in the APA context, no enforcement, but no permitting. And it's a type of thing that members of Congress couldn't live with. Now, maybe that leads to your war of attrition, and
This is a way of
like-
solving the war of attrition.
but yeah, it is. But no, I think that the standoff would either make the president not fire that person or confer with Congress before firing and reach out, figure out what someone that everyone can agree on as a replacement. But I think that's kind of that's how you get around the deregulatory, part of it. And again, the last thing I'd say on the deregulatory part is we're only talking about independent agencies here, or what Congress decides they want to make independent, right? And there's big debates about why they want things independent. Adjudicators, I completely get. Election administrators, absolutely. But some of this other stuff, I think some of it is going to require Congress to think, how much do we really want the head of the Social Security Administration independent? How important is that really? And I think for some of these, they won't. I mean, I think in some ways they kind of just embrace removal restrictions like they did when House vetoes and everything else, without kind of calibrating, do we really want this independence? Is there really independence and things like that? Now, obviously, we don't go into any of that in the paper. That's beyond our. We're already writing well beyond our expertise. But, so that's a whole nother level. So, other questions? Yeah.
Do you have any worries that the majority party might kind of look like they got the lead and took the ball home as soon as they get an agency head in, and then they put all these restrictions so that they can never be fired, or it's very difficult?
Yeah, I mean, so I think this is, and we don't do this in the paper because we don't try to defend it, but Congress is going to start using these tools tomorrow to kind of with independent agencies. With adjudication, we go all in because I think I'm pretty firm ground on that front. But actually, this is one of the ways you do get there, right? Like the right political moment is where Congress, the president has control of both houses of Congress, and they decide to really kind of fundamentally reshape things. And they have incentives to do that, not just incentives to make agencies independent, but also incentives to lock in their gains, right? And so I think that's how you get this to start. Now, I'm personally a big Article 1 junkie. Like I'm a FedSoc person. I'm not really, like, I'm not an original. I'm an Article 1 junkie. I like Congress's role in the administrative state. So I'm actually pretty excited about that. I don't mind setting in defaults that are going to keep independent agencies, are going to keep people at independent agencies in longer. Now, again, Congress has its own costs though, right? If they say, oh, we're going to have a reason-given requirement for firing the Secretary of State, and you're going to have like a 70 vote threshold. I mean, that Congress isn't going to get reelected, right? I mean, like no one in the public's going to be like, oh yeah, the Secretary of State should not be like controlled by them. So I think that they have political limits as well, even if they do control, you know, the Congress and the White House. But I do think that's the moment it's going to take to get there. And some of the stuff I just kind of flagged, you don't need legislation for a lot of this. I think it's stickier if you put it in legislation, right? It's harder, but a lot of this you do through Senate rules or quite frankly, House rules. If you're thinking about hearings and notice requirements, in a House rule, you could say, they don't provide notice requirement for these X, Y, and Z firings, we're going to hold a hearing on that, right? They can always hold a hearing anyways, but pre-committing that in a rule sends the signal to the president that the costs are going to be higher. So there are definitely ways to do this without bicamerals and presentment. You're all like super excited about independent agencies now. You're like, when else? You're like torts and prim, whatever.
A few of them have had to hear me drone on about it at length. I mean, all this stuff is as durable as statute, right?
Yeah.
That's sort of the upper bound of it. And one of the great challenges, whenever you're doing anything in this space, is that all of these people can renege anytime they want, right? In the following, way, right? Like, so say we have a political moment, and I think I'm way over my skis whenever I talk about history at all, right? But I think like the New Deal, right, is where you see a lot of these independent agencies, and that was like one of these moments where they were like technocratic decision making will lead us out of this horrible.
I mean, I think we had it again in the 70s too.
Oh yeah.
Quite frankly, I think we had the reaction in the 80s with Reagan. I mean, just a different, they come.
Yeah.
And it's again though, Congress has to make its case, right? I mean, if it can't make the case for independence, if it can't sell it to the public, they're not going to be able to sell it. But for some things, they can definitely sell it. Elections, well, bad example.
Yeah, it was a great example.
The chair of the Federal Reserve has to be one, right?
You say that.
Where you kind of really want, where you can sell it to the public. The president shouldn't be the one that's in charge of that. Yeah.
But I think that your last comment there, it's not entirely clear to me that anybody can sell anything to the public anymore of true independence. Like, I think we're so hyper partisan that it's very hard to take that step back on either side. And I don't know what you do with that, except to say, like, one would have thought elections was kind of sacrosanct. Like, that is something that we would want independent control of, the financial regulators. And I don't think that that's where the public is anymore. So if you take out the sort of sense that, the public is behind independence, and instead say the public is deeply riveted, and half of them are going to believe whichever the Democrats say, and half of them are going to believe whatever the Republicans say, and that's going to align with where Congress and the president is. What does that do?
Yeah, I mean, my easy answer is agency adjudicators, right? I mean, I think there's strong support across, conservatives, libertarians, and liberals that they need to be independent. And I think a lot of other inferior officers within executive branch agencies are pretty, like inspector generals, what Margaret Schlingle calls like offices of goodness, where you have ombuds and like the National Taxpayer Advocate, like those I think are easy sells today, especially if they lose some of their removal protections, which I think they will. I think the Supreme Court is going to very soon kind of announce that they have to be removed, at least by agency heads. So that's the easy sell. The harder sell is the multi-member, the Humphreys executor, right? I think that's the harder sell. And I would have thought elections was an easy example. I would have thought federal financial regulators. I think financial regulators are still probably much easier than elections, strangely. I never thought I would have said that. And by the way, elections are polarized on both sides now. I think if a Republican, I mean, it's at the national level, it's a mess, right? But I'm trying to think through, it's interesting because sometimes Congress, we could have a whole nother discussion about theories of agency independence. Usually it's to remove power make them a little bit more insulated from presidential politics. That's but another way to frame it is to give more power to Congress, right? And so like, it's not surprising to me, like the National Labor Relations Board is an independent agency because the Democrats want, whereas other ones like financial regulators, I think have more of a kind of a bipartisan buy-in. So it's interesting to kind of, as I'm thinking through all the independent agencies, it's interesting
One
to
of
think
the
of some are and
things
some aren't.
that makes this tough and frustrating, I think that kind of goes to the heart of that, is that we have this tapestry of independent agencies, right? And then what we have is the court, right? Because we're talking about democracy and we're talking about faith in what the people want, however ill-conceived or riven they are, right? And we have the court heavily insulated, right? Probably the most in the Federal Reserve, right? But it'd be hard to get rid of the court by statute tomorrow. We could with the Federal Reserve, sweeping them all away at once, right? And that's a lot of work to kind of then rebuild. So I think that might be like the backdrop of where we are now puts even the theoretical argument in sort of a different light. It might be just working the back of our brains.
You got to kind of rework everything, especially if Humphrey's executive goes, you got to rework a lot of that. It's interesting because you think of like on the flip side, the FBI director is not independent, doesn't have removal protections, right? But does have a term of office similar, like a soft tool. And I actually think a president's going to think 20 times before trying to fire the FBI director. That probably was always the case, but I think the Trump experience reinforced that actually.
Well, nothing makes you look guiltier than firing the oversight.
Like that, so you've got like, you've got the soft tools. Again, now you could argue like, is it correlation or causation? Like, are the soft tools helping there? I think they help maybe on the margin, but it's also that Congress has identified what area where the public thinks, no, like this is not a position where we think, even though the president can fire them at will formally, that the president can get away with that without some really, really good reasons. So it's interesting.
Flip it around. I think you could say that Congress has been pretty obstructionist on appointments to executive branches.
Yeah.
And where you would think the same institutional, like we need a working agency, and yet they're totally willing to go political on who they'll see through and who they won't, and how the filibuster will be used on a whole host of executive branch appointments.
Yeah.
Where you would think they would buy into like we need a working agency, and they.
Yeah, and I agree. And I didn't go into those tools too much. Like in the hard tools, the idea of slowing things down, like which they do now, you could also speed it up, right? I mean, and that actually could be an anti-removal tool as well. As like for inspector generals, for instance, you could say, we're going to do this just like Congressional Review Act type, no, like the time of the committee, there's a deadline when you have to vote by, it has to be an up-down vote. If not, it's reported right out for floor. You could actually speed things up. So for certain types of, if you want like a faster confirmation, you have those kind of approaches too, which is a weird dynamic to think that actually is an anti-removal power, but it could be. I don't know. You could also play a lot with actings when it comes to, when it comes to inspector generals and others inside executive agencies, where all right, career bureaucrat is in charge, has all power. You just kind of move things quickly that way. So. There are ways to play with it.
I mean, that's one of the appeals of the process. There's lots of dials you can pull, right? Which is nice in a very large, diverse administrative state.
Well, that concludes our program. Please give a round of applause. Thank you all for coming. We'll have our next event on Thursday.
Our program is crazy.
Yeah, I'm not comfortable with this.
Are you?
I don't have much time.
I think students are just dying for events, at least at Ohio State. Like after a year of like Zoom events where you can barely pay attention, they just want to be in person and see each other.
Oh, it's true. Well, it's interesting. I'm sorry, I didn't always do that after one. I was only paying attention.
Oh, it doesn't matter. Yeah, I mean, maybe it matters to them.
And this is what happens when they invite us out. They have to deal with
I
this.
know.
Yeah, well, like it went like, I don't usually present a paper for this type of stuff. I also usually do know if I'm already there, but I wanted to present the paper. So.
Yeah.
When I
It's
knew you were
interesting.
here.
I haven't had a chance to actually read it yet.
Yeah, well, it's a little out of my wheelhouse, but when you spend that much time writing that stupid program, you
Yeah,
gotta
no,
get
it's nice
something
to be able
out.
to like.
You gotta get something out of it, right?
Yeah. You gotta wheel something out of it.